Hello everybody, this is your instructor Dr. S in Stockholm, Sweden. As you can see behind me is Lake Brunnsviken in the center of Stockholm in Haga Park, which is the Royal Park. It's quite beautiful. There are very old structures on the lake as well as water sports, and it's very much green and fitting with the local Swedish tradition to be outdoors as much as possible. So here you have me sitting by the lake, giving you a overview perhaps of this class for today about providing to family. My overview of Sweden is going to be very brief, but we'll cover this a bit more next week. But I think it's pretty safe to say, and in some ways in the U.S. we romanticize Sweden, thinking of it as a kind of a paradise for families, particularly young children and older adults. For the older population, it is pretty clear that the situation is perhaps better than it is in the U.S. with fairly high pensions. That is, most people retire fairly comfortably on their pensions, free or inexpensive home care, social services, and health care. So the state does support what we might call vulnerable populations to a larger degree, but that's not to say that there haven't been some stresses and strains on the Swedish welfare state. Of course, Sweden is facing the same kind of global pressures as we are in the U.S. in terms of the balance between public outlays and the kind of tax base that it has, and is experimenting with various forms of adjustments. Some would call retrenchments in kind of the welfare outlays. But even with those changes, I think it's safe to say that Sweden is a much more liberal welfare state than the U.S. and even many other Western European countries. Today's topic is about provisions to the family by older adults, and the topic is fairly broad, so we can think of transfers or provisions as being kind of tangible help, such as grandparents who are raising their grandchildren. We can think of it in terms of money provided to young adults and others in the family. We can also think of it in terms of the symbolic investments that grandparents, older people make in their children and grandchildren. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about one of the readings because I think it was one of the first articles that or pieces of research that examined this sort of transfer. And in this research with Casey Copen, who was a former graduate student at USC, we examined the degree to which grandparents influence their grandchildren in terms of religiosity. Now, religion takes on a lot of different forms. You can think of it as belief, ritual, practice, attendance. You can think of it as a set of values. We took a fairly narrow definition because of the kind of items we had in our survey to look at what we might call biblical beliefs, and this is very much entrenched in a Judeo-Christian point of view, but nevertheless 90% or more of our sample would be Christian or Jewish or at least have roots in those religions. So what we did was we examined grandparents in 1971 and asked them a series of questions about their religious beliefs. What we did then was ask the parents as well as the grandchildren when they became 16 and older. So this had quite a time lag of about 30 years to kind of examine how grandparents, as they expressed their religious beliefs in 1970, influenced the grandchildren almost 30 years later, some of whom, maybe many of whom, weren't even born when the grandparents were assessed. So we're really looking at a long period of family history. And what we found, in a nutshell, was that grandparents exerted an influence on their grandchildren by about 10%. Now, 10% doesn't sound like very much, although it was statistically significant. 10% was what we found when we controlled, that is, adjusted for the parents' religiosity. So independent of the parents' contribution, this 10% came from the grandparents. And if you take into account what we might call the indirect influence, that is the grandparents who are influencing the parents, who are then influencing the children, that goes up to about 30%. So grandparents both influence the grandchildren directly, and they influence the grandchildren through the parents. Now, how does this work? Now, this is something we didn't examine, but one can imagine that the influence of grandparents, at least for religion, and maybe many other values and beliefs, comes through direct contact. That would be called socialization. It could be formal training. It could be attending religious services together. It could be practicing rituals in the home. But we do know that grandparents in many families are considered the repository of family traditions, and religion, being as important as it is in the United States, is one of those firmly held values and traditions. And so grandparents, the legacy of grandparents, and even after, of course, they were deceased, the grandchildren carried forth the set of values that grandparents inculcated in them at some point in their childhood. So we thought this was a very interesting finding, and we're following this up with other forms of religiosity, as well as more general belief systems, because one can imagine that religion is just one part of a big puzzle of beliefs and values that people carry with them. And whether a person is a moral person because they have religious beliefs, of course, is up to debate. We can think of highly religious people who may not be the most ethical of folks. But there is a rough correlation, perhaps, between that. But we're interested in more global beliefs. How do people feel toward egalitarian issues, that is the relationship between men and women, the relationship between the rich and the poor, what's the obligation to serve others. These are broader questions that go, I think, beyond, but are part and parcel of religion that I think would be interesting to look and see how older people transmit those values. It's very common to think of younger people striking on their own, adopting the ways of their birth cohort, hooked into social media and kind of ignoring older people. But in terms of family transmission, we do see grandparents influential. It might be unconscious on the part of grandchildren. They might not even be aware of how they've been influenced, both directly and indirectly. But in fact, we can find it. We see it in our data. Wanted to give you a capsule, perhaps, of the study that you'll be reading this week. Show you a little bit of Lake Brunsviken and the Swedish, you might call this countryside, but this is actually urban Sweden, where I am right now, on the very edge of the city. And I hope you're all having a good week, and we'll be in touch soon. Have a good one. Bye.